excluded for whatever reason, you can choose. ASIO have a right to issue warrants to enter your premises and to search. They have a right to remove computers, hard drives. They can remove virtually any document, and they can exercise that right in the same way that police can do in a normal, the commission of a normal crime. They can take anything that they believe assists them in compiling intelligence. What they do say to you, though, if you're formally interviewed, is that you have an indemnity. So you might say, I am aware that something's going to occur. I don't know where, I don't know when. I'm aware that people are gathering for a particular purpose, and you might say, and I'm involved in that. Whatever you say to ASIO, the one safeguard you have is that it cannot be used against you for the purpose of prosecution. Whatever you say to the Australian Federal Police is different, of course, that can be used against you. But what you say to ASIO cannot be used against you in your own prosecution. So that's an important point. They can hold you for up to 7 days continuously, 168 hours they say in the Act, and it can be extended by breaks, and it can be extended if an interpreter is required. And you saw the debacle of the Dr. Hanif case in Brisbane, where shamefully they detained Dr. Hanif and made continuous applications for extension of time for the purpose of interrogating a man that had done nothing wrong, and his worst crime, of course, was to be associated through family, distantly, from people who were involved in the Glasgow bombing. So let me talk about a number of the cases that we've had. I think one of the most disgraceful prosecutions in this country has been the prosecution of Jack Thomas. He went to Afghanistan in its reconstruction after the expulsion of the Russians in 2001, along with a number of other people who you know, some of whom be named, Shane Kent, David Hicks and others, and it was not a crime to go to Afghanistan in that period. So he went there lawfully and legitimately. After 9/11 occurred, of course, there was something like 20,000 foreign nationals in Kandahar, and he escaped the carpet bombing of Afghanistan after 9/11 and went to the northwestern provinces of Pakistan, and he remained there for a period of time before arriving in Karachi in January of 2003. He was intercepted at the airport, and as you all know now, was kept in detention in Pakistan with US backing, military institutions for a period of 5 months. And then in June of 2003, not because of any support from the Australian government, only because of agitation from his family and members of his community, and some people within the media, that we were able to get him to be brought back to Australia, despite the reluctance of the Australians, because we'd known what happened to David Hicks at that stage. We knew that he'd been a sacrificial lamb in being sent to, with Mamdouh Habib, been sent to Guantanamo Bay, and we wanted to avoid that happening to Jack Thomas. So in June 2003 he came back to Australia, and then in November 2004, as you all know, those of you who know him, having come back to his community, reuniting with his wife, having another child, working 3 jobs, buying a very modest home in Werribee, in a fanfare of publicity, he got arrested in November 2004. And in that fanfare of publicity, how was he described? He was described as Osama bin Laden's white boy in Australia, as the sleeper cell waiting to be activated. They thought that he was going to be activated within 6 months of his return to Australia. He did nothing. He continued to work. He continued to pray at the mosque at Werribee. He continued to look after his family, did nothing. They said, well, that shows you how effective he is. He sat back and done nothing. They waited another 6 months. He did nothing further. And then he was arrested in November 2004. And of course, when he was arrested, we had the full theatre of his arrest. We had the helicopter hovering over the court. We had the dogs running through the courts. We had police in full gear with submachine guns and everything else outside the court. And we had really, in my view, and I'll be criticised for this, but in my view we had a completely hysterical response about his arrest. And of course he was put into detention and solitary confinement because they then said the crime that he committed, and let me say this to you, his real crime, his only crime, was his conversion to Islam. That was his crime. He was a white man who converted to Islam. Having done that, he was arrested. And I think the reason now, absolutely certain about this, the reason he was arrested was that the authorities wanted to send a message to the community. If you convert to Islam and you support Wahhabist military ideology, I don't want to say jihadist ideology because I know what jihad means, but to use the West term of jihadist ideology, then you will be punished. We will make you a sacrificial lamb and we will make an example of you to others. So he was arrested, put into solitary confinement, terrible circumstances, was denied permission to see his family and his children, and then finally the following February we were able to get him released on bail. He was then charged, as you probably know, with providing himself as a resource to a person either connected with or associated with Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. And the support was being in Pakistan and receiving people who were sympathetic to the work of the Taliban, not Al-Qaeda. But that was enough to have him charged with that offence and receiving resources from a terrorist organisation, which was his passage back to Australia. Took 6 years before he was finally exonerated. We were successful in an appeal, and then again after the appeal, what happened was that he was charged as a result of a documentary that he participated in Four Corners, explaining why he went to Afghanistan and talking about his conversion to Islam. Shamefully, the authorities used that as a basis to re-prosecute him. And so what did we have? We had someone who was a convert to Islam, having gone to Afghanistan and was literally held out as an example to others that if you do any of this and you support the Taliban or any other organisation, you will be crushed. And it's had a terrible toll on him, as you all know. So what happened? Well, at about that time, Nasser Ben Brika and those people through his DARS classes got arrested for an offence of fostering or nurturing a terrorist attack. And you don't need to identify any specific terrorist attack. And you remember Abdullah Mehi was said to be the MCG suicide bomber. Absolutely laughable allegation. Front page of the Herald Sun. And how did he get charged with that offence? Well, because of telephone intercept material, they were able to show that when Abdullah was talking to Nasser, he was talking about what had occurred in Iraq and the killing of innocents, and said, if we kill 100,000 people in Iraq, are we able to kill 100,000 people here? And there was discussion about that. But that conversation, as meek as it was the basis on which he was charged with providing himself as a resource as a terrorist to a terrorist organisation. And the terrorist organisation was not them being members of Al-Qaeda or Taliban or any of the other Islamist organisations. They were their own unnamed and unspecified organisation. Their point of common interest was that they all went to Nasser Ben Brika's dance classes. That was their point of common interest. And so Abdullah was acquitted of that charge because the jury could not see that there was anything remotely like an allegation that he had provided himself as a resource. But what those boys were convicted of was, of course, being members of the organisation. They paid a terrible price, the 4 men that were acquitted, Bassem Rad and the others, Shui Hamoud, the others who were acquitted, Hani Taha, paid a terrible price, having been in custody for 3 years. And even though I think the authorities thought that the prosecution against some of those men were weak, they persisted with them because the purpose of the prosecution was not so much how much jail sentences might be imposed in the long term, but they were going to spend a long period on remand without any right of compensation, without any apology for the way they were treated. And then more recently we've had the episode of the Somali, it's described as the Somali case, but there are a number of other Lebanese boys, Naif Al-Said and Wassim Fatal, as well as the Somali boys who were charged with conspiring to commit an act in preparation of a terrorist attack. There's never been a charge of that nature in the history of criminal prosecution in Australia. So it's conspiring to commit something in preparation of a terrorist act. So what did they do? They talked about how easy it was to breach security at the Holsworthy Army Barracks. And their conversations were recorded when Wassam Fatal was in jail, and they were recorded over the phone, and said some stupid things over the phone, but it's because of what they said resulted in their conviction. And this Friday they are going to be sentenced in the Supreme Court. Two of the brothers were acquitted, but there are 3 others that have been found guilty, and they're going to be sentenced on Friday in the Supreme Court. Now, whatever happens, we're going to be appealing that decision because we think it's got to be more than a question of simply what you might say over the phone, where there are no concrete plans in place, where there's no purchase of weaponry, where there's no other specific action or plan, and to simply talk in the way that they did, in our view, should not constitute an offence. So what's the point of all of that? Well, here's the first point. You need to be very careful about what you say and to whom. If you talk about conflict in Palestine or conflict in Somalia, if you talk about the expulsion of Ethiopian troops, or you talk about other wrongdoing, if you talk about isn't it great that Mubarak's been overthrown and that the Muslim Brotherhood will finally take power, you talk say any of those sorts of things, then you can expect your phone calls are going to be monitored. So that's the first thing. Be very cautious of what you say on the phone. The second very important lesson, it's a very important lesson, is to be wary of infiltrators, because none of these cases can succeed without the infiltration of what are called covert operatives. They are people from within ASIO and the Australian Federal Police who act as informers. We know that in Nasser Ben Brika's case there was a Turkish